Welcome in town in Montreal. First of all, a few of us were introduced to your work with your band Porcupine Tree, and that's how I met your music. I know you work on many other projects. What would you say is the difference between a Porcupine Tree album and a Steven Wilson album?
I think the main difference is that being in a band obviously is kind of a democratic unit, and being in a band does necessitate some kind of compromise. That's part of what's good about being in a band. And if you think of a band as in the case of Porcupine Tree, 4 individuals who, if you think of it in terms of a diagram, so you've got 4 people, and there's this little part in the middle where these 4 circles cross over, and that's the bit that you agree on. That's the kind of style of music that you agree that you want to play. But outside of that, there's all this other stuff that all of us want to do, not just me, that all of us want to do. For example, we're at a jazz festival now. Now, there was one guy in Porcupine Tree that hates jazz. So how could I ever get a jazz influence into the music? Well, I couldn't really. So one of the things that's kind of liberating about being a solo artist is being able to explore all of those other kind of sides of your musical personality and to find a way to kind of bring them all into the music. That's one thing. And the other thing I think is just being able to work with, many other different kinds of musicians, not always having to... I mean, again, it's a wonderful thing about being in a band. It's always the same people, but sometimes it's nice to be able to say, you know what, it'd be great to have a different kind of, musical personality on this track, the drums or the bass, the keyboards. So I've really kind of enjoyed that liberation from that side of things.
Is it the end of the band, or will Porcupine Tree will ever reform maybe one day? Or
it will never become my prime focus ever again. But I could see a situation where we might make another record together. But I think realistically it would now be a side project to me. My solo project is now established as my primary focus.
So you've mentioned your interest for jazz music. We are right in the beginning of the Jazz Fest in Montreal. Do you often receive invitations to play in Jazz Fest, or is it?
It's just the first.
It's the first, yeah.
Yeah.
Tell us about your interest for jazz music. Is it? I guess it's not new for you, but how did it sort of impose, because you wanted to explore more into jazz music, to dive in that
Well, you
more?
see, I grew up, as I think most people must be aware if they know my music, I grew up listening to a lot. Although I grew up in the 80s, I grew up listening mainly to the music of the previous decade, the 70s, and primarily the sort of conceptual rock music of that decade. But within that, of course, without necessarily being aware of it, you are exposed to jazz music. If you listen to bands like Jethro Tull or Soft Machine, you kind of get this kind of exposure to jazz music by default without necessarily being aware of it. Bands like Caravan and those kind of bands. So I think I responded very well to those kind of musicians without necessarily being aware that I was listening to jazz music. And then, of course, somebody played me Bitches Brew by Miles Davis, and it began to make sense. And so you kind of begin to follow the trail, So certainly that was a kind of doorway to me to the whole world of jazz music, those early kind of progressive jazz bands or rock bands that were kind of incorporating jazz into their sound. Even if you listen to bands like Yes, there is a strong sort of jazz element in their DNA. So I kind of got opened up to that whole world through those early sort of progressive rock bands, and subsequently have ended up exploring the whole range of jazz, even to extreme, experimental, free jazz and stuff like that. And I think one of the things I wanted, we talked about this before, one of the things I wanted to do setting up a solo project was to bring that spirit of jazz into the music, have improvisation, because I didn't have any kind of improvisation in Porcupine Tree. And then the first thing I knew I needed was a great keyboard player that could kind of tap into that side of things. And I was very fortunate to hook up with this guy, Adam Holtzman, who played with Miles, for many years in the 80s. And I remember having a conversation with him, and I said, look, the sound I'm looking for is that kind of early 70s, Chick Corea, Zavanel, Fender Rhodes, distorted Fender Rhodes, and he said, that's exactly what I'm all about. And so Adam has been a great kind of asset in terms of tapping into that side of things for me.
And when you started to work on this solo project, like the first days that you were in your studio, starting to compose new material, what did you authorize yourself to explore at first?
Well, I think the main thing was leaving space for improvisation and solos. Now, in Porcupine Tree, everything was very tightly arranged. You know, there wasn't a lot of, like I said, there wasn't a lot of improvisation. Pretty much the show from night to night would be identical. Same notes in the solos even. And the first thing I did when I started writing solo material was leaving these long spaces, long vamps, long kind of periods where I imagined solos from Fender Rhodes or flute or saxophone or guitar or whatever it was. And I just had in my mind that I would get musicians in that could kind of, you know, paint on this canvas that I had created, this blank canvas that I created. And that was a very different philosophy to the way that I'd always written before, which was to write very tight and to not allow these long spaces for solo. Did
you discover things about you, Steven Wilson, while doing those things, being the only master, deciding and...
Well, I've always been a control freak, you know, even right from the beginning. I mean, Porcupine Tree started out as a solo project. The first 3 solo albums were just me playing all the instruments myself, albeit I'm a very limited musician. But the answer to the question is probably not a lot, because I kind of always have had that mentality of being the captain, you know, the control freak, the guy kind of organizing. I think it was more, as I said before, just knowing that I wouldn't have to fight. I wouldn't have to deal with politics. When you're a solo artist, you don't have to deal with the politics of sort of going up to the other members of the band and sort of having to persuade them to do things. It's just like, no, this is what we're going to do. And I always knew that was what I was really like, you know. So it was, in some ways, it was kind of more of a struggle to try to be a different person in a band context, knowing that actually I was more naturally a captain, you know, and it's been nice in this band to actually step away from actually being a musician and just be like the director. You know, there are moments on stage where I'm just standing up now and being a frontman and singing. I don't even have a guitar. I don't have to worry about being a musician anymore. And I think always I imagine myself more as the kind of auteur or the director or the person calling the shots. So it's been nice to finally be myself in a way.
And we've talked a lot about Porcupine Tree, but there are many other projects. You were involved in No Man,
right.
In Blackfield. There's Storm Corrosion, Base Communion, Incredible Expanding Mindfuck. You've also worked with Opeth. So there's a lot. You seem interested into visiting different territories. Do you see yourself as an explorer, and then you return to a base, or?
I mean, I don't see it in such grand terms. For me, it's simply a reflection of all the music I listen to and all the music I love. And I've always been very curious. And I think that one of the things that always disappointed me about, you know, people say to me, you're kind of a freak, aren't you? You're always doing all these different things and you seem to work every day. And I genuinely don't understand why there aren't more people like me that seem to be interested in working across all genres of music. You know, I'm happy to work on ambient music and noise music and pure pop and jazz and progressive rock and death metal. For me, it's just music. It's just good music and interesting music. And in a way, I see myself as the normal one and everyone else as the strange people. Just like staying in one genre your whole career. I mean, that seems really odd to me. And I think it's partly because of, you know, my parents were very eclectic in their musical tastes. And so I grew up in a house where we'd be listening to, you know, quite serious intellectual rock music, but then also ABBA and the Carpenters and the Bee Gees. And I still love, to this day, I love pure pop, you know. When it's done beautifully, for me, is as sophisticated as any form of intellectual, in inverted commas, music. So I have this great love of everything from the most extreme experimental music to the most pop music and everything in between. And I guess I've never found it strange. It's everyone else that's found it strange that I should do all these different things.
And you seem to be very inspired and to be well nourished musically. Do you go to many concerts, or are you doing a lot of research, or how do you keep the well full?
I don't go to a lot of shows. I mean, one of the things about being on the road, like I've been on the road now for 4 months with this band, is like the last thing you want to do when you get home is go to a show. You know, it's like going to the office. So I don't go to shows, but I do still voraciously devour music. I discover music through, I buy vinyl, I buy CDs, you know, and I still buy probably 10 new albums every week, or not necessarily new, but new old, you know. I'm always discovering things. Just when, the thing about the history of music is just when you think you've heard everything, something else will come along and surprise you that you didn't know about. And I think also your musical tastes change as you get older, so things that didn't make sense to you as a teenager suddenly click. And I find that happening a lot as I get older. And I'm always amazed by how much music, how much fantastic music is available and still there to be discovered, even at my age. So I think I'm still very curious and still very passionate about discovering music I'm not familiar with.
Do you listen to music when you are on tour?
Sure.
And what did you listen when you came this morning from Toronto on the tour bus?
I haven't listened to anything today, but I was listening yesterday to a British musician called James Blake, who I'm a big fan of.
Okay.
You know James Blake? So he's this guy that has this incredible kind of almost Marvin Gaye soul voice, but his music is like electronic music. I find that really interesting, and I just discovered him. I was listening to an old jazz album by a guy called Les McCann called Invitation to Openness. Somebody might know it. No? Early 70s Atlantic jazz record, very inspired by Miles, kind of in a silent way. And again, that's a record that I was just introduced to, like, you know, in the last few weeks, and completely fallen in love with it, you know.
I heard you saying that you don't like to repeat yourself musically. When you started to work on the last album, And Cannot Erase, what did you add in mind? What did you want to explore exactly?
Well, that's an interesting idea, interesting question, because the thing about the music for me is it always comes from the story, the underlying story. So I'm someone that likes to have a concept to base a record on. I don't like to just go and write 10 songs. I like to have a kind of underlying story. And in this case, the story, actually in most cases, the story kind of informs the musical style and the musical direction. And in this case, it was a story about a young woman who comes to live in the heart of a major city in the 21st century and basically disappears from view. And so it's a very modern, contemporary setting. Some might say almost industrial setting, you know, being in the heart of the metropolis. And it's a story about the arc of someone's whole life. So for me, there was an opportunity to write an album, firstly, that very much felt like, you know, it was set in the modern age, so more electronic sound, more industrial sound. And also, it was a story that followed the arc of someone's whole life. So there were many different aspects, you know, songs about nostalgia for childhood, songs about living in the modern age, songs about loneliness, melancholia, anger. And so it's a very eclectic record, but it's a very, hopefully it also sounds like a very contemporary, you know, a record of this moment. And that's not always the case with my record. My last record sounded more like a kind of vintage, almost old-fashioned 70s sound, you know, because again, the story suggested that approach to me.
And you've mentioned this girl who arrives in a big city, and there's a woman, Joyce Carol Vincent.
Right.
She inspired you. She was found, I think it's like 2 years after she died, in front of her television. Nobody called her, even friends or family. Is it something that you've read in the newspaper, or how do you find out about this story?
About 10 years ago, so just to recap, about 10 years ago, this woman, Joyce Carol Vincent, was found dead in her apartment, and she'd been there for more than 2 years. Now, that in itself is an extraordinary and shocking thing, but at the time I heard that in the news, I think I assumed what I believe most people would assume, that she was a lonely little old lady. And it wasn't until I saw a documentary made about Joyce Carol Vincent about 3 years ago by a filmmaker called Carol Morley, and the film is called Dreams of a Life, that I discovered that actually the opposite was true, that she was a very young, popular and attractive young woman. And that made it even more shocking and even more extraordinary. And it was at that point that I started to question, how could this happen? How could someone that had friends and family, that was young and attractive, how could someone disappear so completely? And the more I thought about it, the more I could understand. You know, we live in a world now dominated by technology, dominated by social networking and the internet. And if you really want to disappear, and there is this kind of aspect of her that almost, she almost like she deliberately disappeared. It was almost like she deliberately disconnected herself for whatever reason. And if you want to do that, I think you would go and live in the heart of the biggest city in Europe, or one of the biggest cities in the world. Because if you do that, you will become invisible. If you don't make a point of making yourself visible, it's very easy to disappear. And we live in the age of social networking where everyone believes they are somehow connected and somehow communicating and interfacing with the outside world. But of course, nothing could be further from the truth. There's this kind of sense of disconnection going on, an alienation going on. Facebook, social networking, which of course is very antisocial. You have friends on Facebook, of course, friends that you will never meet. And I think that this kind of connected with the fact that this was someone that obviously was naturally kind of insular and damaged, meant that she disappeared from view, even from the view of the people that knew her. And I found that extraordinary. And I think there's a little part of everybody that kind of fears that almost happening to them too, you know. It's something you can very easily imagine could happen to anyone given the right circumstances. So I found that fascinating, and that became my starting point for kind of tracing my character. My character is not Joyce Carol Vincent. My character is effectively a facet of me, but a fictionalized facet of me, kind of, I guess, mixed with Joyce Carol Vincent. But trying to trace this young woman's life and figure out how this could happen.
And you now live in London. Did you grow up there, or was it in a smaller town? Is it like a personal reflection that you had when you arrived? Yeah.
I was born in London. I moved out of London with my parents when I was quite young, but I moved back to London to be a part of the music industry. And I've actually recently moved back out again. But I was there for 20 years, and my experience was very similar in the sense that I lived for 20 years in London, and I never knew the names of my next-door neighbours, and I never knew what they did for a living, and they didn't know who I was and what I did. These are people I lived next door to for years, and I don't think this is unusual. Now, a few years ago, I moved out of the city back to a small town, only 25 miles north of London. Within a week of moving in, I know everyone in my street. I know the name of my postman. I know the names of the local checkout girls at the supermarket. It's a completely different mindset. There's something about living in the heart of the city that engenders this sense of paranoia and withdrawal. You know, you saw earlier this year in Paris with the Charlie Hebdo massacre. Those guys that perpetuated that atrocity were living next door to people. And the journalists went and interviewed these people that lived next door to the terrorists and said, we said hello in the corridor, but we didn't know anything more about them, you know. And I think that's typical of what it means to be living in the heart of a big city. You're almost afraid to know what the people living next door to you are doing.
Maybe you would like Montreal because it's a middle-sized city.
Maybe so, yeah.
The title, Hand Cannot Erase, with the dots between all those three words. Mm-hmm. It's a singular title. What does it mean to you?
I'm not going to tell you, but I'm going to explain. I'll answer the question by answering why I'm not going to tell you. I think one of the things I really miss in rock and pop music these days is a sense of mystery. And the sense of enigma that for me, when I fell in love with music as a kid in the 80s, and I discovered all these incredible bands in the 70s and 80s, was that I couldn't know too much about them. You know, the only way you could really find out anything about, you know, these musicians was perhaps they would do an interview in the Melody Maker or New Musical Express or Rolling Stone, and you could go and see them live. So you get to see what they look like by, you know, seeing them on live. And occasionally they might be on a TV show or something. That was it. That was all you could know about these gods. And they were gods because they were kind of removed from you. And so there was this sense of magic and enigma. Now, some people could say that's bullshit, you know, and we've torn all that away now, which is a good thing. But actually, I don't think it's a good thing, because I think a lot of the romance and the magic has gone out of rock music. I think it's something interesting that the hip-hop artists understand a lot better than rock musicians these days. Rock musicians have also almost been complicit in the tearing down of all the enigma, you know. So they tweet and they Facebook and they go on reality TV shows. I mean, Ozzy Osbourne being the classic example. To me, when I was a kid, he was a god. Now he's just an idiot that can't operate his own TV. Do you know what I mean? And, you know, I still love the music, but a lot of that kind of sense of enigma has gone out of it. Now, this is a very roundabout way of explaining to you why I'm not going to tell you what the title means. One of the things about titling an album or even a song is that you're almost telling the listener, this is what the album is about. Now, I could have called this album The Loneliness of Living in the City, because it is about that, but it's also about so many other things. It's about loss, it's about nostalgia for childhood, it's about the internet, it's about anger, it's about disconnection, it's about so many things. How do you give an album a title that's not going to be too specific about what the album is about and kind of rob, I guess, the listener's ability to insert themselves into the process and interpret it for themselves? So my answer is, give it a title that means nothing, or at least means nothing to them. It does have a meaning to me, but it is kind of ambiguous, it is enigmatic, and one of the things I love is that people have come up to me with their own interpretation of it, which is nothing like the intended interpretation. But I think that's good, and I think that's for me, that's why music is still the primary art form. It requires something from the person that experiences it. If you read a novel or you watch a piece of cinema, everything is explained to you. You know exactly what the characters are thinking because it's all there in writing or it's all up there on the screen. With music, you don't get that. You have to, as the listener, you have to insert yourself somehow into the process. You become a part of that experience. You interpret the music. You interpret the lyrics. I love that about music. I still think that's why, for me, it still is the most powerful art form when it's done well. So I love the fact that the Hand Cannot Erase title is being interpreted in so many different ways, and ways that I didn't necessarily intend, and ditto with the album as a whole.
You were talking about the mystery around some rock star. On your blog, on the Hand Cannot Erase blog, there is little videos where you explain things very clearly to your listeners. Is it important to be linked with the people who receive your music and to exchange with them or to get their point of view?
Well, based on what I've just said, you would probably think I would answer no to that. I'm not sure if it is important. It's like I said to you, I don't think there was much of a connection or dialogue between musicians and fans before the age of the internet. And I think most people would agree that music was in a healthier state in previous eras. So there must be something in that. I think, I was reading, I think it was the guy at Kiss was saying on TV the other day that it's the fans, in a sense, who have destroyed rock music. I think he was being slightly tongue-in-cheek, but there is something in it that it's almost the fact that the fans expect access to musicians. Like, some bands sell VIP tickets. You can go and see their sound check. You can go and have dinner with them. I don't do any of that stuff because I think actually that is counterproductive to the magic that is this kind of relationship between the musician and the artist. And one thing I think the worst thing you can do as a musician is ever listen to your fans what they want. Don't ever listen, because everyone has an opinion, and I think the most important thing is you make music in a vacuum. There's a great irony or a great paradox about being an artist, which to be an artist, I think you have to be incredibly selfish. But at the same time, you need people to buy what you do. There is a kind of inherent paradox in that you cannot pay any attention to what your fans want. To evolve as a musician, to be true to yourself, you have to be incredibly... No one is going to tell me that Picasso painted paintings to please other people. I don't believe it, And I think he's an example of a great artist, but people fell in love with what he did because of that, in a sense, that kind of selfish approach. And I think, again, that's something that is partly under threat now, that musicians, because there is the internet and there is Facebook and there is social networking, I can do a show today and tomorrow morning there will be 200 people reviewing the show. And they'll all have a different opinion, but they'll all express their opinion as if it's incontrovertible fact. How can that be the case? How can 200 reviews all be absolutely factual? They can't. They're just opinions. And you can get lost in the noise of opinions.
The album before And Cannot Erase is also beautiful. The Raven that refused to sing. There's a few mysterious characters on this album. There is the holy drinker. There is the watchmaker, the raven that won't sing itself. I was trying maybe to find a visual echo of all this world, this universe that you presented. And I thought about maybe Jérôme Bosch paintings, maybe a bit of Tim Burton, the Tales of the Grimm Brother meets Edgar Allan Poe's story.
Right.
I was wondering what would you say?
Well, you're pretty close to the mark. Yeah. I mean, I think I love ghost stories. I love classical ghost stories. You know, Edgar Allan Poe. There's some fantastic English writers from the turn of the century, early 20th century, like M.R. James and Arthur Machen, and they wrote ghost or horror stories, but in the true sense of the word, not like the kind of modern version of Hollywood horror, you know, in the sense that they preyed on, it's a psychological horror, and I loved those books, and kind of together with all that, I was thinking a lot about mortality and death at the time because my father had just passed away. Now, when you lose a parent, it does kind of focus you very much on death and mortality. And I started to think a lot more about it and what did I really want to achieve with my life, and that kind of taking stock thing was going on. And I started to write these songs that were each was like a self-contained ghost story. And most of them actually are to do with loss. And I think if you look at a lot of the classical ghost stories, they are ultimately about this idea of loss and dealing with loss and dealing with mortality and the human psyche and the way that we kind of deal with those things and process those things, losing a loved one. Edgar Allan Poe's stories particularly tend to be, it seems to me, about loss and about dealing with death. And so I wanted, in a way, to write my own contemporary volume of ghost stories in the form of an album. But we also did publish this beautiful special edition that had long-form stories in them. So that was kind of a really nice thing to be able to do, almost publish an album as a book of short stories.
Between the rock intensity of your music and the more peaceful moments, it's contrasted. And what I like about your music is that you give us space sometimes to just land somewhere and to breathe. Do you also feel the music this way when you play it, when you sing it?
Yeah, I mean, I like dynamics, and I've always seen the records I make as analogous with making a movie or writing a novel, in the sense that you are trying to take the listener on some kind of journey. And I get kind of tired, or much as I love certain musical forms, I get tired when I buy a record and it's just basically 60 minutes of exactly the same musical emotion, I kind of like death metal, but I can only listen to about 5 minutes of it in one go because it is so one-toned, it's monotonous. And one thing I loved about those 70s artists that I grew up with was this sense of musical journey, this sense of musical continuum, like I'm going to take you on a journey, much the same way that a film director does or a novelist does. So you are going through these different emotions, different musical terrains, mellow sections, loud sections, depressing sections, joyous sections, And the trick for me, and what I feel like I still get better at as I get older, is learning how to make that all seem cohesive, because it can be a real mess, if you don't find the right way to tell the story. And I don't just mean literally in terms of the lyrics, I mean tell the musical story. So the story, even without all the words and all the lyrics, for me it's all about telling some kind of story or taking the listener on some kind of journey through the music. So as you say, there are moments where you can breathe and just kind of immerse yourself in a rather beautiful sound, and then there are more aggressive moments. And I think that's all part of telling that story.
Is it true that it's your parents that introduced you to prog music?
Well, I don't even know what prog is, and they didn't know what prog was. I mean, what is prog? Prog, prog is a word that was never used by the original bands. I mean, I know because I've worked with some of these guys now. And if I asked Robert Fripp or Steve Hackett, I said, did you ever call yourselves prog or progressive? No. He said, we were just, you know, we were doing our thing. We were just making underground music. And it's similar with my father. My father had no conception of what, you know, what generic music was at all. But like a lot of people in the 70s, he did go out and buy Dark Side of the Moon. And he went out and bought Tubular Bells by Mike Oldfield. And I would hear these records when I was too old to really understand anything about music, you know. And I didn't necessarily like them or dislike them. I just heard them and absorbed them. And I think it's one of those things, when you're that young, you are like a sponge, so you're kind of soaking up things without necessarily being aware of it. But it's interesting, we were talking about, or I was talking about the idea of albums as musical journeys, and my mum used to listen to Donna Summer a lot. Now, I don't know how familiar you are with Donna Summer, but those early Donna Summer records with the Giorgio Moroder are very conceptual. And the very first Donna Summer album, Love to Love You Baby, the first side is a 1:16 long minute, what I call a disco symphony. And it's amazing. It's still one of my favorite pieces of music ever. And it does have the same sense of journey and structure in the so-called prog bands. And so for me, it's not something unique to progressive music, this idea of musical journey and structure and shape. So yes, it's true to say that my parents definitely, in my father's love of people like, you know, Floyd and Oldfield, and my mother's love of great disco music, introduced me to this idea of the album as a kind of, you know, storytelling device, yeah.
Many musicians described as prog rock musicians don't like at all the term prog, but we'll have to talk about it. I'd like to know, how do you cohabit with that term? Because you're often presented as a prog musician.
I know, yeah. I never called myself anything. You know, I mean, listen, I'm very aware that my music is in the tradition of the classic 70s conceptual rock bands. Of course, I acknowledge that, you know. People can listen to my music and they'll hear echoes of King Crimson and Pink Floyd and whatever it is, you know, of course. But they'll also hear a lot of other stuff in there. I mean, from my interest in electronic music and all that other stuff, and just pure pop too, that's all there too. But I guess if you do anything that has delusions of grandeur in terms of making these kind of musical stories and statements across albums, and you do anything that tends to be, say, outside of the traditional pop form, verse, chorus pop form, pretty soon someone's going to call you prog, you know. Listen, I don't believe there is any such thing as progressive music anymore. All of us are... In 2015, everyone is using a well-established musical vocabulary. I don't think it's possible to be truly progressive and do something that no one has heard before. I'd love to be proved wrong. But listen, I listen to a lot of music and I haven't heard anything. Probably since the mid-90s was the last time I honestly was hearing things that I was saying to myself, I've never heard anything like that before. Mm-hmm. Most of the music, much of which I still love, that I've heard over the last 20 years, is not progressive. It's using an established musical vocabulary. And there's nothing wrong with that, you know. There's nothing wrong. I think you can still invest music with a feeling of freshness by having a fresh perspective. You know, strong personality, fresh perspective, you know, on the same kind of things that people have done before. And that's really what I'm doing. And hey, that's what most people are doing, you know. You can't hear any music now without hearing something that's gone before, a precedent. I don't believe it, you know. I'd love to be proved wrong. But all the music I hear, the music I love, the music I don't like, I can immediately hear, okay, they've listened to this, and they've grown up with this, and this, and this, and this. And, you know, and part of me thinks it was always thus, you know, because I think we kind of look back at these amazing bands like Led Zeppelin and the Beatles and think they somehow came from nowhere, you know. And, of course, Led Zeppelin stole everything from Chicago bluesmen, and the Beatles started off by copying American rock and roll records. So I don't think it's unusual to be, you know, kind of influenced or stealing. And so this whole notion of what is progressive, I find rather confusing. I don't really... Yeah. I think prog has just become a label, like punk. You know, when people call Blink-182 a punk band, that's not punk. It's polished. It's American college fodder, you know. Punk, for me, was, you know, really raw and, you know, and vital. So I think, like, you know, there's an analogy there between the way people use the word punk and the way people use the word prog. It's just become a label.
For prog music, it's kind of confusing because well, you've sort of managed to raise yourself above the preconceptions associated to the genre. So first of all, that's great because you were not so associated with that. I don't know, that people seems to think it's something for initiated listeners, really hardcore fans, and some people say that you help redefine the genre for the 21st century. Some other people say that prog rock doesn't exist anymore. There's something not clear about the genre.
I think, like I said, I think most people have an idea in their mind that prog is when you start exploring beyond traditional pop song forms and you start telling stories through an album, through music. And of course there are examples outside of progressive rock that you could say the same of. Mike Skinner, The Streets, did a concept album, you know, and so it was in a kind of hip-hop way. But I think most people associate those approaches with this notion of prog rock. There are certain sounds, I suppose, that people associate with progressive rock. Mellotron, I do use Mellotron, I love Mellotron, you know. But then again, Tom Waits uses Mellotron. It's not something just, you know, just sort of associated with progressive rock, but most people kind of immediately, it presses the button that says progressive rock, you know, which is how Radiohead ended up getting called progressive rock. They started using Mellotrons. And I think also there's something about progressive music that tends to deal with the more kind of weighty, melancholic side of life, you know, more intellectual, should we say. You know, and I'm also aware that Hand Cannot Erase, conceptually, is kind of in a line of albums, starting with something like Pete Townshend's Tommy and Quadrophenia, and then Roger Waters writing The Wall, and then Tom York writing OK Computer, about alienation from modern world. So there is almost a tradition of progressive rock musicians writing these kind of weighty albums about their alienation from the modern world that they live in and their sense of detachment from the world that they live in. And like I say to you, I'm aware that I'm very much in that tradition, but I don't kind of analyze it. And I don't sit down and say, you know, I'm 10% jazz and 5% electronic, and you know, I just make the music that I make. And honestly, I don't listen to a lot of that music now. It's in my DNA because I listened to it so much as a teenager that it will always be there. But I'm not necessarily aware of making prog or progressive rock. But I'm told quite frequently that I do.
Since a few years, you remix classic albums of the 70s and of the 80s. King Crimson, Jethro Tull, yes, Gentle Giant, Emerson, Lake and Palmer. While doing this, do you want to preserve a certain legacy of those albums?
Why am I doing it? I'm doing it because I got asked to do it, and who's going to say no to that? You know, I got asked to do it. But the primary reason for doing those records is to create surround sound mixes, 5.1, because of course they were never mixed. Some of them were mixed in quadraphonic at the time, but most of them have never been mixed in 5.1 surround sound. So that's the reason I started doing the project. And being, as we've already discussed, being primarily associated with the world of progressive rock, most of the invitations I got to start with were from progressive rock bands. But I've now moved out. I'm doing the Tears for Fears catalogue, XTC, Roxy Music. So I'm starting to diversify now into some other music too. It's been amazing. I mean, to be able to deconstruct and then reconstruct that music, the music I grew up with, some of that music that made me want to be a musician in the first place, is incredible. Why I want to do it? Well, I want to do it because I want to learn. I want to meet the people that made the music and be able to talk to them about how they made the music. And I also want to perhaps present that music in a fresh way, hopefully for a newer generation of listener. I do have some fans that listen to my music that don't know anything of that music. They don't necessarily know where I've come from musically. So there are young kids now going out and buying remixes of King Crimson albums or Yes albums because I've remixed them and discovering that music, and that's amazing to me. To me, it's the analogy I use is it's like cleaning the Sistine Chapel. You don't want to change anything about what's painted there, but you can just make it shine perhaps in a fresh way for a new generation.
It's well said. So you'll be in Montreal tonight and tomorrow. I've noticed the way you give space to each musician you work with in your music. There's space for the flutist, for the saxophonist, and they are virtuoses. Who will be playing with you tonight?
Okay, I don't have a sax flute player with me this time because Hand Cannot Raise actually is not, ironically, is not such a jazz influence record. But I have a 5-piece band, including myself, guitar, keys, drums, and bass. The keyboard player is the aforementioned Adam Holtzman, who's kind of the jazz guy in the band at the moment. The guitar player is a guy called David Kilminster, who spent the last 8 years playing with Roger Waters, actually. So he did The Wall. He was the guy being Dave Gilmour on top of The Wall for the last 8 years. So he's the guitar player. My bass player is a guy called Nick Beggs, who became famous in the 80s by being in a band called Kajagoogoo, who had a big #1 hit. And my drummer is a guy that has never been really aligned himself with a band before. He's spent the last 20 years of his life being a kind of demonstrator for Roland drums and Pasty, and being more of a clinician, a drum clinician. So you can see they're a real mixture, you know, and then there's me, that I'm not really a musician at all. I'm kind of like this conceptualist. So it's a real mixture of musicians from different backgrounds, the 80s, the 70s, the jazz scene, the rock scene, the pop scene, you know, the technical scene, and it just gels beautifully, and I've been very fortunate.
And tell us about the way you use multimedia in your concerts.
Right from the beginning, I always saw music. We talked about the influence of cinema, or the way that I felt music could be analogous with cinema. I've always seen music in terms of pictures and images. Right from the very start, when I've written a new song, or I'm even in the process of writing the song, I'm already seeing it in my mind as a movie. But I have no ability, you know, to photograph or to make films. But luckily, I'm collaborating now with 3 extraordinary filmmakers, one of whom is an animator, to realize the songs in visual form. So I sit down with them and I talk about the ideas behind the songs, and they go away and they create these beautiful video accompaniments. And they are a big part of the show. I love multimedia experiences. I almost don't think it's enough in 2015 just to kind of walk on stage and just play the record. I think there's so many bands out there. I mean, there are more bands out on the road now than at any other time in history, partly because you can't make money from making records anymore. So all these bands are forced to go out on the tour, you know, on tour, like for months and months. So you're in competition, you know, with so many other bands for people to buy your tickets. And I think it was important to me to give them something beyond what they might expect from just a regular rock show. I mean, okay, maybe if you go and see Muse or Roger Waters, you'll get a multimedia experience. But at this level, it's quite unusual to see such an elaborate visual accompaniment to the show. And I think that's one of the things that makes the show really special and stand out.
And as we said, you are really prolific. What will you be playing tonight? Is it the last album that you're touring with, or?
The show is based around Hand Cannot Raise as a framework. And within that, there are songs from earlier albums kind of slotted in. I'll say no more than that.
Thank you so much. Do people here have questions for Steven Wilson?
You have a great album with Hand Cannot Raise. Is there any leftover material for an EP like you usually do from time to time?
Yeah, I always try to write a lot more music than I need and then filter it down to something that works. Not necessarily, the stuff that gets left out isn't necessarily the stuff that's not good, it's just the stuff that doesn't sometimes conceptually fit in. So yes, the answer is yes, and probably there will be some kind of accompanying mini album or yeah, the outtakes, as it were, yeah. Yeah, I don't know when that yet.
Thank you. And finally, one more question. On the Raven that refused to sing, I believe you worked with Alan Parsons. Is Tales and Mystery of Edgar Allan Poe a bit influenced the material on that album?
I do love that record. It was coincidental in the sense that I wrote the record long before Alan was attached to the project, but there is obviously a strong commonality. I mean, I did certainly listen to that record a lot when I was a kid, so it's probably somewhere in my subconscious, yeah. It's a great record.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Are probably your parents' generation So I remember when MTV started, I was intrigued when you were saying about how you don't like impressions of music to be put on people, you like them to make their own impressions.
Right.
So when MTV came along, I instantly avoided it for exactly that reason, because I found the idea of music TV to be a complete contradiction.
I do. I think MTV, unfortunately, along with the advent of compact disc replacing vinyl, were effectively things that started the music business into a state of devolution. Because music that had, starting with the mid-'60s, the albums like Pet Sounds and Sgt. Pepper, for about 10 to 20 years there, music really seemed to be about something more than just how good you looked and what you could do in a 3-minute pop tune. And unfortunately, MTV cast us right back where we started to an extent. So I'm afraid, yeah, I agree with you. Although I do love visuals, I mean, I love the idea of making visuals with music, the idea of the sort of, performance video. It's how good you look and how good the dancers look, and that's not music, is it? That's not music.
I remember when I first heard the Go Chasing single, Jo Wiley played it on Radio 2, and she said, actually, if you see the video that goes with it, it makes more sense. Which is absolutely true. It does work on a different...
seen that video.
If you see the video that goes with it, it looks like a completely different level.
I mean, there are some videos that I think are amazing and I think are as good as any piece of, cinema. But they are few and far between, and MTV don't show them. Or at least they didn't. MTV don't show any videos now, do they? I remember seeing the Aphex Twin video to Come to Daddy, for example, or the Massive Attack video to Protection, the Michel Gondry one. They, for me, that's art. That's genius. But they are exceptions, yes, certainly, yeah. No one makes videos like that anymore, except me. Merci
Thank
beaucoup.
you so much.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.